Dan communicates with his friends named Gans and Bell as they wait for a basketball match between robots called Bigfoot Basketball or BFB to begin across all the TVs in town. They initiate their plan as soon as the match begins and Dan starts breaking all the TVs one by one while the police chases after him. Gans uses the police's distraction to steal the chips from the broken TVs and Bell guides Dan to all the TVs while the whole town from above. He manages to break the biggest screen before escaping the police equipped with robots known as Bigfoots. Gans sells the stolen chips and Dan takes the largest cut, but he also mentions how he needs to do something big to make BFB disappear. They see the poster of an upcoming match in their town and Gans mentions how Dan hates Bigfoot because they stole his little sister named Coco's future. Dan goes home with a gift for Coco which turns out to be a pet, but Coco does not like it, so Dan's personal shape-shifting pet named Spanky eats it. Coco tells Dan to stop destroying the TVs, otherwise he might get caught soon, and this makes him angry, so he leaves the house. He plays basketball at a park where a girl comes up to him and reveals that she is a Bigfoot mechanic. Dan starts yapping about how much he hates them and she drags him to her house to show him something. The sun sets and the advanced city named Moon's Eye finally lights up, which makes Dan think about how he will send Coco to the moon to get her legs healed. The girl throws Dan inside a Bigfoot and the lucky guy gets to experience female touch for the first time. She makes him operate the Bigfoot and he starts enjoying it but ends up thrashing the Bigfoot. He goes back home with some tickets for the upcoming match, given by her, and he ends up going to the BFB matches he hates the most. The match begins but the audience finds it extremely boring compared to how the TV used to show it. Dan suddenly recalls how the girl is named Miyuki, who was his childhood friend, so he rushes to her and she takes him to a Bigfoot. He gets on top of the stadium and announces that he is going to show everyone how basketball is played. He begins dribbling through all the players and police while making a mess of the newly built stadium, but he gets blocked at the last moment. His Bigfoot gets destroyed and the police manage to catch him. They take him to jail after beating him up and the judge punishes him with a year of jail for his past and present offenses. Dan spends a year inside the jail, assuming that people saw how boring real BFB is so they won't be interested in it anymore. He gets released but gets confused when he sees tons of Bigfoots playing basketball in the streets and Gans appears out of nowhere before revealing that Dan is now a legend in the streets. Dan and Gans head through the town where Gans shows him how street ball has become a norm even since his little stunt and how he has become famous. A group of kids run up to him for an autograph and somebody throws a market at him which he uses to give autographs to kids. They all run away and a girl then thrusts some flowers into Dan's hand. She doesn't say anything else and leaves while Gans and Dan head to his home for the ultimate renewal. Dan greets Coco at their home and starts yapping about how he has been away, but she just shuts the door on his face. He keeps trying to justify himself, but she simply throws a bill at him which shows that he has got 3 billion yen due to destruction of the stadium, cancellation of matches and so on. Gans motivates him by saying that he can try getting a part-time job and he then leaves him alone. Dan walks out of his home and he recalls that he and Coco used to play a lot of basketball together, but one time she got into an accident with a Bigfoot due to which her legs were crushed. She was taken to a hospital where the doctor told him that the nerves in her legs are damaged beyond repair and Dan started cursing and making a scene right then and there. The doctor then suggested to him that maybe there is some cure on the moon due to their advanced technology. In the present, the news spreads through the town that Dan has come back ladled with debt and that he has been thrown out of his house. He meets up with his friend Miyuki, who tells him that the latest Bigfoot street ball style is very popular. She later shows him that she set up a business venture for him by building a special Bigfoot for him which will specialize in providing delivery services. He thinks he is too cool for a normie job, but she reminds him that he has to succeed at something if he is serious about going to the moon. They both then go on a test drive through the town where a person even calls them to make a delivery for them. Dan then ends up crashing the machine in one of the houses, due to which he gets another bill and his bill increases even more. Later his friends tell him that he handles the machine too roughly and Gans shows them how he can make sandals out of tires. They then get an idea and decide to use the same sandals under the Bigfoot so that it can easily run over the roof of the houses. They then establish a setup where people start coming to them for delivery services and Dan carries out the orders by making the deliveries in the Bigfoot. Miyuki's grandpa Ayukawa discovers a mechanic loitering around their setup and he realizes that he is a mechanic from the moon who is snooping around for their design. He welcomes him to his setup rather than throwing him out because he thinks that the design should be shared with everyone. Miyuki recalls how his grandpa was a mechanic on the moon, but he came after the death of her father. Dan is making a delivery when he comes across a few Bigfoots playing street ball and one of them steals his delivery from him. Dan chases after the girl named Sela and she keeps flexing her dribbling skills to him. She lures him to a beach where they both have a showdown on who can play street ball the best. She then makes a dunk over his head, essentially beating him, and just then another Bigfoot shows up out of nowhere. The new machine starts throwing basketballs at the both of them, so Dan rushes at him to stop his attacks. Just then, a car carries a princess towards Rolling Town and her attendant informs her that the town is in a booming stage, but she notices a lot of smoke at a distance. Meanwhile, Dan gets knocked by the enemy and he gets up to find that the enemy is gone. He then starts rushing towards his left side when he hears a noise and he climbs up a junk of a tower to tackle the other Bigfoot, but he finds that nobody is there. Just then, he gets hit by another ball from his right side and the other Bigfoot keeps attacking him with balls after balls. Sela sees the whole thing take place and she rushes towards the other Bigfoot to take him down instead. Just when she gets near him, the Bigfoot attacks her with a ball, sending her flying, and she realizes that she feels bliss even though she has been beaten. Both Dan and Sela then eat food together while Miyuki fixes their machines which have been trashed, and the news spreads around town that Dan has been defeated twice by Sela and some unknown Bigfoot. Sela comes across some thugs who start teasing her, so she takes them down easily. She also comes across Iceman, who had blocked one of Dan's attacks 1 year ago in the arena, and he starts flirting with her. She thinks that he is the attacker from last night, so she tries kicking him and he tells her that she is mistaking him with someone else. He then walks away while she feels all sort of cringe romance towards him. The next morning, the princess presents a statue in the honor of Dunkman Dan to the locals, and she explains that he helped people dream and be hopeful about their future. Just then the mysterious Bigfoot attacks the stage with a basketball. Soon the same Bigfoot starts attacking various Bigfoots across the town and it keeps terrorizing the locals. Dan and Sela decide to pair to take him down, and Miyuki suggests that they should all lure the Bigfoot out to expose him. Sometime later, a Bigfoot walks through the town announcing that it's providing fire safety by Dunkman, and the black Bigfoot attacks it with a basketball. It doesn't get taken, so the Bigfoot rushes towards it to take it down, and just then, it gets trapped in a swarm of light from everywhere around him. The Bigfoot operator turns out to be Iceman, and he declares that he is not a player but rather a destroyer. He starts playing rough street basketball with both Dan and Sela, and they all rush through the town as their match escalates. Even the princess notices something wild going on in the town, so she goes to the roof to watch it. They all keep up their match till the cops start showing up, after which they split up without any decisive outcome. The next day Dan's Bigfoot is in an even worse situation than before, and just then, a mysterious woman with the name of Haruka Garcia, who is from the moon, arrives to announce that she is going to be the producer of Dan. The others keep staring at her big talents while she takes off Dan's shoes and starts examining his soles. She raves about how his feet give an idea of what kind of life he has been living and how she only needs to see his feet to determine his character. He keeps trying to stop her because his feet tickle, but she doesn't pay him any attention and keeps talking to his feet. She then leaves him abruptly and walks to the town, where she keeps noticing everyone's feet and making comments on them. The princess's staff informs her that they are leaving the town because she will get in some trouble if she continues her stay, and they don't listen to her even though she wants to stay. Haruka approaches Sela and talks about how her feet seem like they are seeking out powerful men to stomp on them. She tells her to team up with Dan while she will handle the rest. Miyuki continues to repair both Dan and Sela's Bigfoots while Dan starts making deliveries on his feet. Of course, he sucks at this simple task, and Sela arrives to tell him to accompany her. She takes him to the basketball court where they both play freestyle street basketball, and he tries dunking the ball, but she easily steals it from him and throws a long-distance pointer shot which goes through the net. She declares that he cannot beat her if he keeps dunking the ball only, and then leaves him. Haruka approaches Iceman in a bar and asks him to take on Dunkman again, but she doesn't wait for an answer and leaves immediately. She then comes across Miyuki's grandpa Ayukawa stalking her, and she tells him that she knows he is the Professor Ayukawa from Moon who leveled up Dan's Bigfoot to another level. Miyuki's repairing tasks start going out of hand, so she calls Gans and Bell to help her out. Ayukawa arrives with Haruka at Miyuki's junkyard, and they discuss the new Bigfoot shoes that Haruka wants to be built soon. Meanwhile, Dan sleeps outside his apartment while Coco gets a message from someone. She prints the invitation and stuffs it into Dan's mouth before leaving. Haruka issues orders to Miyuki to finish repairing all the Bigfoots by night, and she announces that the rematch against Iceman is happening soon at the junkyard. Dan reads the rematch invitation from Haruka that Coco printed out for him, and she even gives him a lot of canned food to eat, which motivates him to win the rematch for her sake. He even throws one can on Spunky, which gives him an idea for the rematch. Miyuki continues fixing the machines while Belle heads to Dan to help him stick some posters around the town. Later at midnight, everyone gathers at the junkyard other than Dan, and Haruka announces the rules for the rematch, that the winner will be the one who is standing at the end. She explains that any Bigfoot who manages to score a basket will also be the winner, and the match begins at midnight. Both Sela and Iceman head towards the hoop as they keep battling one another while Dan arrives late for his Bigfoot and he notices that Miyuki has made new shoes for all the Bigfoots according to Haruka's design. He joins the battle just when Sela is about to be taken down and he steals the ball from Iceman. He then attacks him by throwing the ball at the street and the ball automatically gets bounced around the town due to many bouncing surfaces that he was putting up earlier with Bell. The ball hits Iceman's Bigfoot and the battle continues. Police sirens suddenly start approaching them, so Haruka calls off the match and tells everyone to escape. Sela and Iceman do not waste a second, but Dan starts complaining about how he still wants to continue. He tries to throw the basketball at Iceman, but Haruka pops it using her heels and tells Dan that she will create another opportunity for him, so he should back off for now. At the same time, a certain princess named Flora wakes up from a dream and escapes her castle the next day to confirm if her dream was real. A few days later, an underground BFB team called the Worsts wins a match against another team and declares itself as the best in Rolling Town. Haruka appears before them and invites them to a match against Dan, Sela, and Iceman. The next day, Dan complains about how Haruka interrupted his match against Iceman, and Haruka suddenly barges into the room along with Iceman and Sela. She starts revealing how people have started playing BFB in the streets with their own rules that allow attacking and destruction, which is called street ball, and that Dan, Sela, and Iceman need to team up to play against those teams. Haruka takes all three of their Bigfoots to improve them before their match, so Dan tries to challenge the other two to regular basketball, but he gets rejected by both. The Worsts suddenly appear at the junkyard and Dan learns that they are the opponents that Haruka has chosen for the match. Dan tries to be rebellious and announces that he is not participating in the match, but the Worsts provoke him into punching them. They beat the life out of Dan in return, who refuses to play by Haruka's rules. Coco encounters a ragged Flora while passing through town and gives her bread, but Flora runs away when Coco mentions the police. Coco chases after her but encounters Dan, so returns home after roasting him. He gets motivated to participate in the match and meets Spanky, who leads him to his Bigfoot. Dan tries the newly tuned Bigfoot and the Worsts also appear along with Sela and Iceman. Miyuki tells them that Haruka went to the mayor to get permission for their match that's in 3 days, and at the meeting, Haruka tries to convince the higher-ups for the match. Just then, they get a report that a few Bigfoot are causing a ruckus, and at the same time, Dan, Sela, and Iceman start playing against the Worsts without waiting for permission. They move around town and the news quickly spreads through town that Dan is playing against the Worsts. Dan enjoys the improved Bigfoot and people start gathering to witness the match. At the same time, Flora almost gets caught by a few savage men and a member of the Worst saves her, but Dan steals the ball from him. They dribble through town while wreaking havoc and Haruka realizes that they've chosen the city hall as the bucket. The trio passes the ball around while dribbling past the Worsts, and Dan throws the ball, which bounces off many buildings before hitting the statue on top of the building. At the same time, two people notice the ball shining as it bounces off the buildings and they call it the legendary tracery. The police start approaching them, so Haruka tells everyone to retreat and Coco calls the new way of playing as Basquash. A few days go by and the term gains popularity through town as people start calling BFB a thing of the past. James Lone, a legendary BFB Hall of Famer, appears in Rolling Town, and the same time, Miyuki scolds Dan for lazing around, not making deliveries properly. Dan complains about how the police try to catch him wherever he goes and that he is bored because he cannot play Basquash. Meanwhile, Sela daydreams about the exciting match she had a few days ago and she almost hits someone, but the person disappears as soon as she stops the car. Flora sees the whole scene from the terrace and realizes that the mysterious person is actually from the moon. Dan runs on rooftops and makes a delivery, but the person waiting for him challenges him to a one-on-one match. The person dribbles the ball at a high speed and hits Dan with the ball after throwing it at a building. Meanwhile, Haruka tries to convince the police chief to delay his mobilization by 5 minutes so they can hold a proper match, but the police chief rejects her due to the collateral damage. She goes to the mayor again and tries to seduce him into accepting her request, but James suddenly appears out of nowhere. Dan gets arrested by the police and notices that the police are asking his opponent for autographs. He learns that his opponent, Falcon, is the lead scorer of the champions of the BFB League, and at the city hall, Haruka asks James why he came to Earth. He suddenly grabs her breasts and states that he likes spheres, which is the most G thing ever done in an anime. He reveals that the executive council is very interested in the street-style basketball being played these days, and he keeps holding her breasts with a straight face. A while later, he announces the start of a new league known as Open City Basketball League, or OCB, where players can play street ball without the fear of police. Falcon tells Dan to join the OCB if he wants to face off against him once more, and Dan declares that he will beat Falcon no matter what. Haruka learns from the police chief that Rolling Town has been declared the home of the OCB and only official players that manage to join the league will not be arrested. Meanwhile, Coco teaches Flora how to play basketball so Flora can pass the tryouts for the OCB. A few days later, round 1 of the tryouts begins and Flora manages to pass it while being disguised as a boy, and the final round between Falcon and Dan begins. Dan wins the tip-off, but Falcon reads him like an open book and Dan has a hard time getting past him. Iceman suddenly interrupts the match and tries to throw a basketball at his old enemy, Falcon, but Dan blocks it. The ball goes into the air and Dan grabs it before trying to dunk, but he misses. James announces that both Iceman and Falcon have passed the first round and offers Dan a league contract straight away. Dan rips the check into pieces, so James gives him jewels so he can repay his debt and tells him that joining the league is like a passport to the moon where he can get his sister's legs healed. He announces that the last round of the tryouts will be an OCB exhibition match between the remaining street players and the official BFB league players. A few days later, preparations for the first OCB match are underway and the group talks about how Dan can easily repay his debt if he signs with the OCB, but Dan has yet to decide what he will do. People get arrested left and right due to the new street ball ban and advertisements of the OCB play throughout the city. Management of the BFB league goes to James to complain about how he is ruining the image of the BFB, so he shuts them up by giving them money. Dan runs back home with a jewel to give it to Coco, but he bumps shoulders with James' assistant named Slash and accidentally drops the jewel into a sewer. Slash asks Dan if he really believes that a jewel is what Coco wants, and he disappears before Dan can reply. Meanwhile, Coco continues to train Flora, who keeps her real identity a secret, and Dan tries to talk to Coco but she does not reply. Dan leaves and Coco tells Flora that what she really wants from Dan is not diamonds or money but something else. Haruka asks James if he is planning to steal street ball from them, and James explains that he is just trying to spread it on Earth. He tells her that the gravity of the Earth is too strong for her soft talons, which is making them sag, so she should return to the moon. After a while, at the same bar, the street ball players discuss how they can defeat the BFB team made up of BFB pros. Coincidentally, Falcon and the other pro players enter the same bar and Falcon mocks the street players by offering to pay for their drinks as they must be broke. A fist fight suddenly breaks out between the two sides and Haruka and Sela enjoy the show. Slash tells James that she met Dan and questions if he will really sign with them. Dan goes back home and recalls how Coco blamed him for her injury, so he quietly leaves again. A few days go by and the group wonders where Dan has disappeared to, but they all assume that he will definitely sign the contract. Sometime later, the tryouts begin, but the fans get disappointed as the OCB contains more rules than regular street ball, which causes the street players to foul a lot. Miyuki finds Dan hiding inside a small storage space and reveals that Haruka and the rest of the group is planning something, but Dan brushes her off. The tryout match between Falcon's team and the street team consisting of Iceman, Sela and Flora is underway, but Dan suddenly interrupts the match. He takes the mic and announces that they don't need anything like rules. He throws the ball, which traces around the town, and all the players join him in a new lawless match. Haruka suddenly appears beside James with a media team to interview him on live TV, and James tells them that the higher-ups want a sport, not the destructive Basquash. Dan announces that this is his answer and he throws the ball, which bounces across town before smashing the jewels that James gave him. James announces that Dan is banned from the OCB for life and Haruka announces the retreat. A few days go by and Haruka reveals that they are getting match requests for a Basquash match against Dan from people across the earth who watch their live stream. A few days go by and Flora tries to head after the group that has left Rolling Town to continue their Basquash journey, but she gets stuck in the desert. She suddenly notices a town nearby, so she hides her Bigfoot in the sand and goes to the town on foot. She hears about a few Bigfoots causing a ruckus, which makes her happy as she realizes that she finally found the group. She heads towards the ruckus and gets run over by a few Bigfoots running away from the group. Haruka finds the knocked out Flora and decides to bring her with them. In the trailer, Dan tries to convince Iceman not to destroy every Bigfoot because people do not want to play against them anymore, but Iceman, being cold as ice, does not care. Flora finally wakes up and explains to the group how she was chasing after them so she could join their group. Dan tries to reject her, but no one listens to him and Flora heads out to find Iceman, who left the bar to watch the moon. She suddenly sees 3 suspicious men digging something and they start chasing her. Iceman saves her from getting caught and realizes that the 3 men are his former teammates. The rest of the group also arrives and his former teammates blame Iceman for injuring them, because of which they had to leave the BFB. Haruka suggests that they should settle their past differences with a match and both sides agree to it. The next day, the whole town comes out to watch the match and Dan has a hard time playing due to the sand. Iceman and Sela also fail to move properly in the sand, but the trio has no difficulty playing. Sela realizes that the trio has already laid down a proper path that only they know about, which they are using to move effortlessly in the sand. Dan tries to steal the ball so the opponent passes it, but Iceman manages to intercept. Dan asks for a pass, so Iceman uses his iconic destroy throw, which hits Dan and bounces back to him. He hits Dan with multiple destroy throws for fun, but the opponent steals the ball and dunks it. Sela manages to lock down the opponent in the next play, which allows Iceman to steal the ball, and he tries to pass again but hits Dan with his destroy throw instead. His former teammate talks about how Iceman can only injure his teammates, that's why he is always alone, and Dan starts scolding Iceman too. He goes crazy all of a sudden and begins throwing destroy throws everywhere, but Dan still refuses to back off. Iceman sends his strongest destroy throw and Dan does not let it go despite getting pushed back, and he finally manages to stop it. Iceman compliments him for grabbing his pass, and they all realize that Iceman's destroy throws were his passes all along. The barrage of destroy throws displaces the sand in the area and reveals a structure underneath, which the trio tries to hide while Dan takes the match by dunking the ball. The next day, the group learns that the trio has been arrested for grave robbing, and the group heads out to find a new opponent. In another town, an idol group named Eclipse gives a performance to hordes of people, and afterwards they make a special announcement. Soon Dan and his group reach the same town, and Haruka tells them that the town has no regulations, so they can roam around all they want. They are roaming around the streets when one of the Eclipse members named Rouge bumps into Dan, and she notices that a group of people are still following her, so she starts kissing him to avoid them. The people walk away, and she also runs away after calling Dan Dunkman. Later, everyone else heads to the hot springs while Flora goes on a separate way because she cannot risk exposing her identity. The girls compare each other's talents on their side of the hot springs, and they even spot Flora, who is in the hot springs, but she keeps her identity hidden. They keep discussing their melons till the mother goddess Haruka arrives, which shuts them up. They all leave the hot springs and come across Flora, who meets them on the way out while a bunch of reporters surround Dan. They ask him how long he has been with the Eclipse star Rouge, and even show him a picture where they are smooching each other. They also inform him that Eclipse has recently announced that they are forming a Basquash team, and that they will be announcing their opponent team for their debut match soon. The next day, Eclipse makes an announcement that they are going to compete against Dan's team, and Rouge even acts all flirty with him on the stage, due to which her fans beat him up. They all soon gather for their match, in which the Eclipse manager Germana announces that the match has a time limit equal to one of the songs of the Eclipse group. The groups start playing against one another, and the idols score their first point right off the bat, but Dan dunks the ball next. He struggles to take the ball from them, and Iceman then scores another basket after stealing the ball from them. Flora notices that the song is actually the live version of their song, which means they have less time than before, and just then Iceman hits Rouge with his special destroy move. She falls on the ground, and Dan rushes to her help as he recalls how Coco was once injured as well. He carries her off the stage even though she insists she is fine, and the audience starts booing at him. They tell him to go back home since he has lost the match, and Rouge insists that she can still sing her part of the song to continue the match for another minute. Just then, Flora starts to sing Rouge's part of the song, and she shows everyone her premium fan Eclipse membership card. She and Rouge insist audience members to sing along as well, and the match proceeds with both teams trying their best. The score gets tied, and during the last moment Dan and Rouge have a face-off in which Dan uses a special move to score a basket. Later the match gets tied, and Germana slaps one of the Eclipse members for acting out and being a loser. Dan thinks that the tie means they lost the match, while Haruka thinks that Germana had some other motive behind the match. In the past, Dan and Coco are fooling around the streets when a stranger introduces them to basketball, and they start enjoying the sport from the get-go. In the present, the Eclipse babes are practicing the basketball, but Rouge doesn't feel too good, and Slash catches her out of nowhere just when she is about to faint. Slash then gives her a gift and disappears. James meets up with Germana and invites his Eclipse team for the first OCB League match. It gets reported in the news that Dan's playing style is evolving, but his team is unable to figure out any change. Meanwhile, Rouge keeps thinking about Dan, and she then puts the memory card given to her by Slash in her laptop. She comes across a detailed profile on Dan, and she immediately heads out after reading it. Dan gives a basketball crash course to Flora when Slash interrupts them both and promises to give information if Dan can steal the ball from him. Dan and Flora play basketball against him, but he uses extraordinary jumps to get away from them. Rouge also joins them, but the three of them are unable to beat Slash, and Dan even ends up pushing Rouge down accidentally. He recalls the accident with Coco, which makes him nervous, and he keeps running around till he runs into a wall and faints. Later, Rouge tells him that Slash is James' most powerful reserve player for OCB despite never officially debuting, and he is famous on the moon. Later, Dan has a dream in which monsters are chasing him on the basketball court, and he runs away after waking up. His teammates discuss his situation and Gans and Bell tell the others about the incident with Coco in which her legs were crushed. They explain that Dan has been practicing even harder since the accident and Sela walks away in sadness. Dan goes to Rouge's house to return her handkerchief and she pushes him inside her closet when she sees Germana approaching the house. Germana comes to give the official invitation to the girls for the OCB match while Dan remains locked up in the closet with Rouge. She challenges him to a match because she thinks he can't beat her with so many issues going on with him and he accepts. Slash gives his report to James who notices that Slash unusually seems involved in the whole matter. Later Rouge and Dan have a street-style basketball match without their Bigfoots because they don't want to attract too much attention. They start playing and Rouge scores points on points over him while he just keeps recklessly chasing the ball. He keeps recalling Coco and even when he gets the ball, he is unable to score because he is very hormonal. He sees Coco and Slash in the audience and he runs into Rouge suddenly. Things start to spiral but then Rouge tells him to score a three-pointer and he finally scores some points. The match ends with Rouge as the winner and they both keep bickering like old lovers. Meanwhile Coco updates the newspaper about the latest development and Slash suggests that she can still basketball in a Bigfoot. Dan and his friends continue to play Basquash matches one after another and their popularity increases due to which they get invited for the OCB championship even though they were banned earlier. They head to the Turbine City for the championship and they find the city filled with huge turbines since the city's main business is generation of wind power. They discuss that the buildings are built to withstand hurricanes so they can play a match without any worry and Sela remains lost in thought. She goes away from the group for her own separate research while Flora notices that one of the roads is named Sela's Road. Soon the people start recognizing Dan and his teammates and they begin to surround the group. They all give autographs to their fans and soon Iceman also heads on his own way. Belle notices that a lot of areas in the Turbine City are named after Sela and meanwhile Sela visits her mother's grave at the edge of the town. Her dad also joins her there and they both pray for her mother. He then tells her to destroy the town if her team wants and she reminds him that he doesn't have the right to pray for her mom because he drove her out himself. She also reminds him that everything happened because he cannot allow a female to inherit his wealth and he walks away after wishing her good luck. Iceman goes to meet Falcon who has also arrived in the town while Dan and Flora come across a group of kids playing street-style basketball. Dan doesn't care about them and he walks away. Iceman tells Falcon that he hasn't come to take his revenge even though he has killed him in his dreams many times. Dan and Flora continue to explore the town and Flora keeps noticing the direction of wind and the local people while Dan pretends not to care about such trivial things. They even come across the venue for the opening ceremony and Dan then runs into Rouge who has come to the town for a ceremony. They keep bickering with one another and Rouge then notices Germana so she runs away. Falcon also keeps an eye on Dan and he discusses with Slash that Dan will definitely like the reward for the championship even though he is like a wild monkey who doesn't care for anything. Flora becomes more frustrated because all of their team members are scattered and Dan assures her that they will all gather soon just like the wind. Sela stays at her mother's grave till late and she keeps recalling how she always saw her mother sad and how she cried a lot when she died. Falcon thinks that Iceman won't kill him now even though he keeps yapping about it. It gets announced in Turbine City that the championship winner reward is a pass to Lunar League and Dan becomes motivated to hear this. He runs towards his Bigfoot and after boarding it he starts dribbling basketball like a crazy psycho. He then hurls the basketball towards the city which bounces off the surfaces of the city and it comes back right at him. Iceman declares to Falcon that he will defeat him in Basquash rather than killing him while Sela also heads back towards her friends. The whole team then unites once again for the championship. The team made up of the youngest players called the Tri-Stars gets selected as their first opponent and the time limit gets randomly selected as 15 minutes. Dan wins the tip-off but gives the ball back to the Tri-Stars to give them a handicap. The Tri-Stars reveal themselves to be a pair of triplets and they quickly juggle the ball between themselves before running away. Sela gets on top of the buildings and assumes that the yellow-haired one has the ball but she turns out to be wrong. Dan sees that the blue one has the ball but the triplets exchange balls at a high speed which confuses them. The spectators wonder why the Tri-Stars are not scoring a basket despite getting many chances and Iceman realizes that they're wasting time. The change in the camera angles reveals that the Tri-Stars are actually using fake basketball-shaped boards to confuse everyone and that they started this tactic the moment Dan gave them the ball. They let the ball go so it can naturally roll towards the bucket due to the slope. Iceman gets on top of the buildings while Dan and Sela chase after the Tri-Stars without realizing what is actually happening. With only a minute left in the game, the ball almost reaches the bucket and two of the Tri-Stars finally stop as their job is done. The third one grabs the ball, assuming that he will easily score but Iceman appears out of nowhere and snatches the ball from his hand. The Tri-Stars rush towards him, so Iceman uses his destroy move to hit them away. The ball goes into the air and Dan grabs it. He performs a layup into the Tri-Stars bucket, which puts them in the lead and they win the match. The Tri-Stars apologize to their manager for losing the match despite betting so much on their victory, but the manager reveals that she is an Iceman fan, so she bet on their victory instead, which won them a lot of money. They breathe a sigh of relief and Sela mentions how Iceman noticed their tricks right at the start, which is why he didn't move throughout the match. Spanky mentions that he also noticed it but didn't want to say anything because it was fun. Sometime later, Eclipse also wins a match and Sela goes to her old home to reminisce about the past. Matches take place across the city as teams quickly get eliminated one by one, and the Eclipse team goes to James to ask about the true purpose of the tournament. Meanwhile, Iceman encounters Falcon again and Falcon mentions how Iceman changed after he met someone. Iceman mentions how he got arrogant and started hating everyone including him. At night, Dan encounters Rouge and she tells him that she wants to play a match against him again so she can properly beat him. They start bickering like an old couple again, and the other two Eclipse members talk about how Dan would never believe the fairy tale they heard from James. The tournament quickly moves forward to the Final Four and Dan recalls how they chose Team Basquash as the name of their team. Unfortunately for the lover boy, they get matched against Eclipse in the semifinals while Falcon faces off against another team full of characters. Sela overhears a kid crying about his house getting destroyed during the match and his mother tells him that they're going to rebuild the town anyways. An old lady mistakes Sela for someone who also lost her home during the match and she leads her to a camp full of displaced people. James and Slash talk about how they will finally see if Dan is the man from the legends who rain down balls like thunderbolts. Meanwhile, Dan and Rouge meet again and she teases Dan for staring at her picture on the billboard. They talk about their match tomorrow and Rouge suddenly feels pain in her head. Dan gets worried about her, so she hits him with a basketball to show that she is fine. The next day, their match finally begins and Team Basquash passes around until Dan gets the ball. He faces off against Rouge, but she manages to steal the ball from him and they play against each other like they're the only ones on their teams. Dan manages to steal the ball back and Flora mentions how they're moving in complete sync with each other. Rouge's condition suddenly gets worse and she falls to the ground. James and Slash take her for treatment where they discuss how Rouge is very important for their plans to bring the legend to light. Slash overhears Germana talking on the phone about how he will reinforce Rouge more even if the risk of her dying is high. Team Basquash learns that Eclipse is withdrawing from the tournament due to Rouge's condition and they've successfully reached the finals, which will probably be against Falcon. They wonder where Dan has gone and Miyuki brags about how she always knows where Dan will go and she looks under the stairs but doesn't find him. Flora mentions that Miyuki cannot predict Dan's movements like Rouge did, which makes Miyuki angry. Rouge finally wakes up again and reveals to her teammates that she did not take any medicines before the match because she wanted to play fair and square against Dan. She apologizes to her teammates for making them lose the match and they all hug cause that fixes everything. After a while, the two girls meet Dan and tell him that Rouge is returning to the moon, so Dan rushes to meet her. The girls also tell him how they got physical reinforcements to play Basquash, which messed up their bodies, but Rouge stopped taking the medicines to play properly against him, which caused her body to worsen. Dan runs as fast as possible but fails to reach Rouge's car and she sets off without getting to meet him. She gets on the plane but sees Dan using tracery to mimic the tune of her song as his last gift to her. Dan declares that he will definitely win the final match and go to the moon so he can meet her once again. Soon, Falcon also wins the semi-finals match and proceeds to the finals to face off against Team Basquash. The night before the match, Dan watches the moon like always and Sela goes to her mother's grave to see her for the last time. Iceman wakes up from a nightmare and Miyuki learns that Gans has been gone for 2 days due to an errand given by Haruka. Iceman encounters Haruka, who gives him a cup of coffee, but his hands start shaking as soon as he grabs the cup. Haruka grabs his hand and realizes that his hand is severely injured. The next day, Dan arrives late to the match and Sela notices how her father has also not arrived yet. All the players gather for the match and the two goalposts are revealed, one being on a moving windmill and the other on top of a huge building. Falcon tells Iceman that they're going to lose, but Iceman does not bother to respond because he is that guy. The teams board their Bigfoots and Flora mentions that a storm is coming, but no one believes her as it's perfectly sunny. The match begins and Falcon wins the tip-off, but Iceman intercepts the ball. He passes to Dan, who jumps towards the goalpost but comes out short. Sela gets the ball but Falcon steals it and scores the first bucket. Sela realizes that she accidentally fell on her old home, which makes her furious, and on the other side, her father plans out the new structure of the city despite people calling it extreme. It suddenly starts raining out of nowhere and Haruka tries to contact Gans, but he enjoys his meal in the desert. Dan has a hard time moving around due to the rain and Falcon flies around on his Bigfoot, flexing on their poor bums. Iceman throws him off balance the moment he steps down by destroying the pipe he is standing on, and he steals the ball from Falcon. He passes the ball to Dan, but Dan slips in the rain and Falcon manages to steal it back. He flies through Sela and Iceman scores another bucket, which further widens the gap. The halftime whistle blows and Gans finally picks up Haruka's call, but his phone suddenly dies. The second half begins and Team Basquash still has a hard time moving around due to the rain, and Falcon scores another bucket. Gans finally arrives with some equipment and Haruka instructs the team to back off to the central plaza where the slope is. They listen to her orders and Flora uses her magnificent throwing skills to put new shoes on their Bigfoots while they're sliding down. Dan uses his new shoes to quickly steal the ball back and scores a bucket, which allows Team Basquash to regain momentum. They score buckets after buckets thanks to the new shoes, and the score gets tied. The rain finally stops and Falcon steals the ball from Dan, but Iceman blocks him. The two clashes against each other and it suddenly turns into a wrestling match for no reason as the two try their best to push the other back. Iceman has a hard time due to his injured hand, but he manages to topple Falcon and uses the last of his strength to pass to Dan, who runs towards the bucket. He jumps up, but Falcon appears before him, so he passes to Sela. She jumps up and scores the final bucket, which secures the victory for Team Basquash. Sela's father feels happy, seeing her win, but a person suddenly appears behind him and silently kills him while the team celebrates their win. The whole team heads to the Skybloom Kingdom, where the moon cannon will take them to the moon. The city is made of marbles and it's made to train people to send them to the moon through the cannon. They all arrive at the city and start to head inside while the guards exempt them from any inspection because they have lunar passports. Later some guards tell them that transportation of machinery and vehicles is prohibited and their Bigfoots get taken away. They then visit the town, which is filled with useless rules and regulations, and some kids even scold Dan's group for not wearing overcoats, which goes against the rules. Turns out that Iceman's left arm is a robotic one and Ayukawa replaces some parts of it, which Haruka somehow got from James. Meanwhile, James informs Sela about her father's death and he blames an opposing faction since James was planning to rebuild the town after the championship. Sela then casually walks away without saying anything much while Haruka comments that feet don't lie. Dan and his group play street basketball and Dan decides to show the kids something even cooler, so he runs away. He then comes back with his Bigfoot and just then an army of Bigfoots arrest him. Since street basketball is forbidden, Dan gets arrested and the local authorities declare that he won't get special treatment regardless of his lunar passport. Haruka pleads on his behalf and James promises to use his diplomatic ties, but the authorities mention that it will take 1 year to clear Dan at the very minimum. Flora then sneaks out and she meets up with her sister, who is also a princess like her, to ask her for help in releasing Dan. Sela wonders why Slash has been acting weird, and meanwhile Dan tries escaping from jail by cutting the jail bars with a spoon because that's ought to work. Flora's sister notices that Flora seems to have gained a lot of experience and that Dan may even be the player according to the legend, but she tells her that they cannot interfere in such matters as royal family members. Flora leaves and on the way she comes across someone suspicious. Soon the same suspicious man helps Dan escape by blowing his jail up, and he introduces himself as Mr. Perfect. He tells him that he will get him to the moon and even blows up another wall, which reveals Dan's Bigfoot. Dan gets inside his Bigfoot and starts to rush to the launch site while the local police chases him. They disregard their rules and surround him, but Flora helps him to escape. They rush to the site with barely any minutes left, and meanwhile Flora's sister tells Mr. Perfect that she has launched the moon program to help Dan out. The countdown launch for the moon cannon starts while Dan and Flora run towards the site with only 1 minute left. They get surrounded by the local authorities and at the nick of time Iceman arrives to save them. He uses his destroy move to take out the police and they all rush to the cannon. The rocket gets launched and all three of them jump on the rocket just then. They run towards the top cannon as all other cannon will be left behind to propel the upper one. Just when they reach the top part, Flora slips down due to too much air pressure and Iceman catches her. They both start to slip down, so Dan catches them both, and in the end Sela saves the day by catching all of them when they fall from the cannon. She pulls all of them up, and meanwhile the rest of their gang gets captured for doing terrorist activities. Dan's group arrives at the moon and they spot some Bigfoots digging trenches on the moon, but just then a huge hand appears in the air and pushes the cannon back towards the earth. The cannon falls in the middle of a wasteland and Slash tells James about how the moon's defense mechanism was automatically activated because the cannon shifted from its original trajectory. James tells him to form a rescue team to find them immediately, and Slash mentions that they're running out of time. The group inside the cannon wakes and Miyuki and Flora discuss the giant they saw on the surface of the moon. Flora tells everyone about the old story of how the Earth was created during a basketball game between the gods, and that a legend will appear, wielding a thunderbolt ball, who will save the Earth and the moon from destruction. Sela and Miyuki suddenly recall how Dan's ball glows like a thunderbolt when he throws it. Flora points out how James specifically sought out their group and held a championship, and she questions if the moon really needs someone who can throw a thunderbolt ball to save it. Iceman reveals that he wanted to become that legend and he chased after that dream, which cost him his arm and leg. He tells Dan that he can become that legend, and he suddenly gets in his Bigfoot before jumping into the huge hole in front of them. Dan chases after him in his own Bigfoot, and Flora's pet accidentally reveals that she is a princess, but Sela and Miyuki are not surprised. Dan falls on a net and sees a whole civilization living underground. People appear out of the shadows and put Dan into a cell, which is nothing new to him. Another person in the cell tells Dan that he is now in Ensville, which is underground, and that he should forget about seeing light again. Another person takes Dan out and throws him in the middle of an arena to fight for his life against another person. The opponent tells Dan to pick up a weapon, but Dan sees his Bigfoot behind him, so he rushes towards the Bigfoot empty-handed. The opponent tries to attack him, but Dan dodges all his attacks and a ball suddenly appears out of nowhere. Dan uses his lightning bolt throw to hit his opponent and knocks the opponent with the ball. The audience chants for Dan to kill his opponent, but Dan refuses to do so. He gets into his Bigfoot and runs out of the arena, so a bounty gets placed on him inside Ensville. Meanwhile, Sela and Flora join a cafe in Ensville to gain more information, and the barmaid turns out to be an acquaintance of Iceman. She reveals that Iceman used to come to the bar every day but ended up losing his arm and leg. Outside, Iceman terrorizes the bad guys in Ensville and tells them to spread the word that Iceman has returned. Miyuki encounters another mechanic named Thousand while searching for parts to repair the other Bigfoots, and Thousand tells Miyuki to leave the moment she hears her full name. Meanwhile, Dan explores some underground caves after getting lost and falls down a hole. Back at the cell, Germana visits the other inmate named Price and tells him to find and kill Dan, who was last seen heading towards a place called Dead Bottom. Dan finally wakes up in a cave and notices another Bigfoot standing there, so his genius brain gives him the idea of throwing the ball at him. The other Bigfoot starts attacking him with the basketball, and Dan tries dodging all of his attacks. The attacks are rough and he almost gets cooked, but the other Bigfoot keeps attacking him relentlessly. His attacks remind Dan of Iceman's attacks, and he then tries grabbing the basketball straight on when he attacks him next. Miyuki and Sela serve in one of the local cafes, and later Sela teases Flora in the bathroom because that is the only talent she has. Dan maneuvers around the cave and scores a point as he puts the basketball into a hole that acts as their basket. The girls watch on the news that Eclipse fans have been gathering outside their hospital where Rouge is kept, but there is no news on her recovery. Dan and the SUS Bigfoot continue their battle, and the other Bigfoot takes the basketball away from him. It then uses a similar move like Dan's lightning bolt tracing to score a basket, and Dan compliments his skills. Turns out that there is actually a giant person inside the other Bigfoot rather than a normal human, and he introduces himself as Navi. Meanwhile, Iceman has his monthly anger episode as he keeps wrecking the houses around him, and Falcon meets up with him. Iceman recalls how he came to the underground a long time ago, in which he lost a battle in the underground battle, and Price cut his arm and leg because he didn't want Iceman to turn into the man from the legend. Germana tells the remaining Eclipse members that they should be the new IT team since Dan's team has fallen down into the underground after their moon flight failed terribly. They agree to take on the job for Rouge's sake while Rogue's treatment carries on. Navi starts mining a special rock called Ultimate in the caves, and he tells Dan that his job is to mine Ultimate, but he doesn't know why he is doing this job. Dan tries persuading him to go up to play Basquash with him. Thousand comes to meet Miyuki, and she asks her to take her to meet Dan, who has become a famous target for the locals. Navi shows Dan a long line of graves which belong to his ancestors, and he explains that his family was brought to Earth to mine Ultimate since they were immune to its poisonous effect, but they started losing their immunity over the time, and that he is the only one left now. Laura and Miyuki head to find Dan with Thousand, while Falcon and Iceman also embark on the same mission. Dan tells Navi that his ancestors would want him to be happy rather than slave away his life, and that he should make the whole place famous through Basquash so that nobody ever forgets about the graves. Just then, Flora's squad arrives at the spot and they get introduced to Navi. Flora feels like the graves are calling her out, and just then Price also arrives in his Bigfoot. Thousand reveals that Price is actually a paid killer, and Price tells Dan that somebody has paid him to kill him. Price attacks Dan with his huge sword, but Iceman blocks his attack with his destroy move. He holds him off while Dan and his company run away so that they can escape to the surface. Iceman warns Falcon to stay away from his revenge match, and Price attacks him with his katana, but Iceman dodges all his attacks. He then jumps in the air and throws the basketball away. The ball bounces off the cave walls till it starts generating current, and it lands on Price's Bigfoot, which damages it. Iceman then launches a series of attacks on him using the same technique, and finally Price's Bigfoot gets taken down. Coco is writing an article when some shady men barge inside her room and attempt to kidnap her. They throw her inside their car, but just then, Mr. Perfect arrives and takes them down. She calls Mr. Perfect James and thanks him while he takes off his mask because his identity has finally been exposed. Slash recalls how a man looking similar to him would watch over Dan and Coco. Dan's group finally arrives at the surface with Navi and they reunite with Ayukawa and Haruka, who become surprised to see Navi the giant. They tell them that Thousand gave them the heads up that Dan's group would be escaping to the surface soon. Germana's minion scientist tells him that Rouge's process is 70% complete and that she started feeling some emotion due to which he had to tamper her frontal lobe. He explains that some brain data may have been lost due to this and Germana just tells him to hurry up. Navi marvels at the beauty of the open sky and the desert since he has always been cooped up in the caves. Sela feels shy around him even though he is her type, but she thinks that he is too big. Haruka starts thinking of shoes designs for him while Flora tells Navi about the legend of giants, according to which giants were responsible for creations of all stars in the sky. He recalls that some of his ancestors said the same thing and Haruka suggests him to go to the moon to search for the truth behind the legend. She then presents the new shoes design for him so that he can play Basquash with others. Thousand asks Ayukawa whether he will come to lead her and Yen again, but he reminds her that experimenting with Ultimite is not for humans. She calls him old and then heads on her way. Flora's sister wonders why Flora hasn't contacted her since she went to the moon, and meanwhile Gans and Belle discuss how they are unlucky to be stuck in prison. A group of Bigfoot stroll through the Turbine City and Germana orders them to evict the citizens. He orders that they should start taking down the buildings and houses even if the citizens do not agree, and the Bigfoots then start wreaking havoc throughout the city. A group of senior management members of the city do not like Germana and they hire James to take care of him. Navi and Dan practice basketball and Navi accidentally sees Sela taking a bath, so she hits him with her brush. Later the girls tease her and she reminds them that Navi is a giant, so they are not a good match. Haruka announces that they are all heading to the Turbine City urgently just when James makes an official announcement that the OCB is going to give another chance to Dan's team to go to the moon. He explains that they have to win an exhibition match against a team of their choice in Turbine City. The group arrives at the Turbine City, which is under construction, and Haruka tells Navi to hide in his Bigfoot since she doesn't want to expose his identity. She even tells James that they will be debuting their new player, and he explains to the group that they have the whole city as the court. He informs them that the city is under martial law by the Lunatic Company, which is run by Germana, and that one of the baskets is on the Lunatic Company's office while the other one is on Sela's old house. He then introduces the group to their opponent team Old Timers, who turn out to be Sela's old basketball teachers, and the match finally starts. Haruka suspects that James has some motive behind the exhibition match and both teams fight each other. The Old Timers are on equal par with Dan's group and Sela recalls her mom when she notices her old house. The Old Timers ask her to think about her father's feelings and she reminds them that her father abandoned her and her mother. The citizens start to approach the city when they hear all the ruckus, and both teams continue to wreck the city during their match. The Old Timers stick to the fundamentals of basketball, due to which they have a good playing style, and Dan declares that he will just think quicker than them to beat them. He passes the ball to Sela, who rushes towards the basket, and she recalls all the moments in which the Old Timers taught her basketball. Sela then rushes ahead and scores the basket, shattering the mirrors of the building where Germana is staying. Germana calls James and accuses him of messing up his city development plans, but he tells him that they are just playing a sport. The Basquash team wins the match, and later Sela recalls some happy moments she spent with her dad. Coco writes an article explaining that a strange man gave her and Dan the basketball for the first time, and he promised to take her to the moon if she becomes a good basketball player. Later he even visited her after her accident, and Coco noticed that Dan started to change right after her injury. He developed a dislike for Bigfoots and she kept treating him coldly because she felt overwhelmed by his emotions. Later Dan got approached by Miyuki and he thrashed the BFG Bigfoots and the stadium, due to which he was jailed for a year. After his release, he overcame his trauma thanks to Rouge and continued to play basketball. According to the legend, the gods dashed through the depths of space in the Age of Myth and they played with stars between each other. One of the stars plummeted into Earth, which created the rivers and mankind. Coco continues to write Dan's story about how he faced Falcon and then decided to play his own version of Basquash without any rules which were put down by James. In the present, she writes down that the people from the moon were seeking the legend's power, but they could never achieve it. Slash then comments that the moon people set up a trap for Dan and they both watch the Earth. Coco thanks him for taking her to the moon, and he reminds her that he made a promise to her ages ago, which makes her realize that Slash is the same person who gave them a basketball for the first time. Meanwhile, Dan tries to practice with his Bigfoot but it starts messing around and Flora mentions that the streets are open again thanks to James who stopped Germana's lunatic company. The girls talk about how Sela likes Navi and the conversation shifts towards how Haruka likes James. Haruka tells them about how she once accidentally went to the forbidden side of the moon where she saw giant footsteps. She explains that no adult ever believed her when she tried to tell them about how giants exist on the far side of the moon and that James was the first person to listen to her properly. Thanks to that, James got his first date with her and they got together but soon broke apart. Flora and Miyuki tease Haruka about how she still likes James but Haruka does not accept it. Dan's Bigfoot suddenly gets damaged and Ayukawa reveals that the Bigfoots are unable to keep up with their skills so they will break again even if they repair it. Miyuki tells them that the output of the ultimate which is powering the Bigfoot is slowly increasing and can explode at any time, so they need to build the Bigfoots from scratch to keep up with their playing styles. She reveals that they cannot do that with the current facilities and Ayukawa points out that they also need specialized data from another ultimate power system. Miyuki explains that the only place where they can carry out the upgrade is Area 0, the sacred ground for Bigfoots, where her father died. Meanwhile, Germana convinces the Skybloom Kingdom's king that the stones will speak again when Eclipse performs its concert. After some time, the guys arrive at Area 0 and Ayukawa boots up the system after many years, which reveals tons of data left behind by Miyuki's father. Back in the kingdom, the two Eclipse members go to Germana to ask if they're really doing the right thing by not telling Rouge about their concert, and Germana states that they're doing it for the sake of the new legend. Back at Area 0, Miyuki decides to perform the upgrade all by herself and requests them to leave it to her even though it will take longer. They agree to her request while Flora's sister finally sets Gans and Belle free. A few days go by and Miyuki continues to work all alone without even eating properly. Ayukawa explains that she is trying to raise her level as an engineer so she can keep the machines up to their standards. Dan gives Miyuki an apple and outside, Ayukawa reveals that he was the one who created the system that powers Bigfoots. He explains that his son was trying to improve it even more, which eventually killed him, and Flora wonders why Miyuki is trying to do something that killed her father. Sela remarks that she might be trying to feel something related to her father through her work, and this makes Flora recall her own father. Inside, Miyuki mentions how Ayukawa created Bigfoots to make life easier for people, but the same Bigfoots ended up ruining Coco's life. Dan tells her that he doesn't hate Bigfoots anymore because of everyone who was able to smile thanks to them. Navi plays basketball all alone and Sela offers to join him, but he teases her about how she will play without her Bigfoot. She gets flustered and walks away, so Navi chases after her. Flora sees everyone so dedicated to their things, which makes her think about how she needs to progress too. Miyuki notices some parts missing in the research left by her father and Ayukawa gives her a hint and she manages to figure out the missing parts by herself. Few days go by and she finally brings out the upgraded Bigfoots, which look the same as before from outside. The guys get into their Bigfoots and feel as if they're controlling the Bigfoots just like their own bodies. Haruka points out that the Bigfoots are moving smoothly like a real person now, and Ayukawa compliments Miyuki for doing a great job. Meanwhile, on the other side, Rouge dreams about her memories of Dan disappearing and she finally wakes up. At night, Flora dreams about the moon coming closer to the Earth and Dan throwing the ball towards the moon to save them just like the legend. The next day, advertisements of Eclipse's last concert before disbanding play throughout Earth, and Flora wonders if it's also related to the legend. She goes to Dan and finds him all confused about everything that has been happening lately. Meanwhile, Germana tells the king that they will use Eclipse's song to activate the ultimate ore, and he mentions how the king is the last remaining speaker, who is essential in their plan to prevent the Earth and moon from colliding. Germana goes to check up on the preparations for the concert and sees Eclipse girls playing basketball. Afterwards, they remind each other to stay strong so they can make the legend come true with Rouge. At night, Flora notices that Dan has disappeared and Miyuki tells Flora to use the scooter to chase after him. On the moon, James tells Slash to continue with their plan even though they have no idea what Germana is trying to do with Eclipse, and they discuss how to bring Dan to the moon. Back on Earth, Flora manages to catch up to Dan, who is on his way to the concert to see Rouge despite being confused about what he really feels for her. The next day, Germana tells Thousand that all the preparations are complete and Dan will definitely come as he is necessary for the birth of the new legend. Meanwhile, Flora and Dan get dressed in female outfits to hide their identities, but Dan blows his cover while comparing himself to the wanted poster. They manage to escape the police and decide to use the sewers to enter the city, but they end up falling into the water. On the other side, Germana explains to the two girls that they will activate the ultimate ore and use the force of its reaction to push the moon back into its orbit. Underground, Dan tries to make Flora strip so she can warm up and she ends up kicking him in the balls. They manage to enter the city and Dan somehow manages to hear Rouge singing on an aircraft thanks to his monkey ears. He chases after the aircraft while making noise with his ball, but Rouge doesn't hear him and he ends up getting surrounded by the police again. He uses his lightning bolt throw to fight against the police and Flora decides to finally drop her disguise to help him escape. Dan gets surprised that she is a woman and they rush towards the concert to meet Rouge. They reach the stadium where even Flora's royal status doesn't allow them to pass through, but her Platinum Eclipse membership card gives them permission to enter. Germana watches them enter the stadium and he brags that everything is going according to his plan. Dan looks around the stadium and finally finds Rouge. He says awkward things at first and passes the ball to her, but she slaps the ball away before asking Dan who he is. She assumes that Dan is a fan and Dan tells her not to joke around. She tries to call security, but the other two girls calm her down and they pretend as if they don't know Dan either. One of the girls signs his basketball and Rouge starts feeling foggy, so the other girl takes her away. The Eclipse member named Citron apologizes to Dan and says that they don't have time to talk right now before running after her band members. Underground, Thousand informs Germana that everything is ready on her side and Germana tells her that all the Basquashers should have also arrived by now. On the surface, the rest of the group also arrives and thank Flora for helping them pass through. Flora mentions that she didn't do anything, but they don't take it seriously. Dan crashes out about how Rouge ignored him and shows everyone how the other girl named Citron challenged him to crash the concert. Ayukawa tells them that the Bigfoots are ready to move and the group decides that they will ruin every good event like always. At the castle, the king asks Germana about the rumor of Dan being inside the city and Germana tells him not to worry as the second coming of the legend might require some over-the-top performances. At night, the concert finally begins and Eclipse starts their performance. The people get to watch K-pop before it gets famous, and outside, the group decides to kick off their plan too. Dan finally destroys the gate at the most critical moment of the concert and makes a spectacular entry. Citron announces that they'll be holding a final Basquash match and the two girls tell the confused Rouge to follow their lead. They get inside the Bigfoots and a goalpost suddenly appears out of nowhere. Rouge and Dan clash at tip-off and start wreaking havoc across the city. The king orders Germana to stop them from destroying everything and the match continues despite the police being on their tails. Flora tries to score a bucket but the police knock her down and Navi pretends to be a policeman arresting her. The king sees Flora on the big screen and asks her sister if she knew what Flora was up to. Flora's sister asks him if he even cared about where his daughter had disappeared to and what she was doing. Navi subs in for Flora and he and Sela work together in perfect harmony. The king sees the people excited about the match and Dan uses his lightning bolt to prevent the police from coming close. Rouge starts feeling a sense of familiarity and begins playing like she used to. Dan and Rouge start playing one-on-one and they start glowing while running around the city. Rouge finally recalls all her memories with Dan and they dunk the ball together. The force from the dunk activates the underground ultimate ore and the police suddenly interrupts the romantic moment by shooting at Dan. The moon suddenly turns red and soldiers point their guns towards the king. The police try to capture Sela too, so she runs away and Navi helps her escape, but he gets caught under falling debris. Miyuki escapes with Haruka and Flora, who half-consciously talks about how Dan traced the path to the moon. Debris starts hitting the earth and the dramatic Flora screams in pain like she was hit instead. The whole of humanity watches the destruction and Slash mentions that the moon and earth will collide in 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the king believes that the people will save him from Germana's martial law, but Flora's sister tells him that they have no reason to save a king who neglected them. Slash tells Coco that Germana's objective is the moon cannon and reassures her that Dan will be able to overcome this hurdle too if he really is the legend. Meanwhile, Thousand wonders how Dan was able to perform the lightning bolt to activate the ultimate without any reinforcements. Eclipse goes to Germana to question why Dan was shot and he tells them that it was due to confusion in the chain of command. He reveals that they will create the legend now by using activated ultimate to make a legend bullet which will destroy the moon but save the earth. The third girl named Violet opposes his idea of killing all the people on the moon to save the earth, but Citron supports his plan. Rouge and Citron tell Germana that they will convince Violet somehow and Germana tells them to be ready to calm down the people after their plan is done. Gans and Belle take the group out of the city and Haruka tells them that it was all a setup to bring Dan out. Miyuki decides to head back to Area Zero to repair the damaged Bigfoots and the rest decide to rescue Dan in the meantime. On the other side, Citron and Rouge reveal to Violet that they were just pretending to agree with Germana to get more information from him. They talk about how Dan is the only one who can recreate the legend and they decide to rescue him too. On the moon, Slash suddenly feels a lot of pain and says that they're running out of time, but she will bring out the legend no matter what. The Eclipse girls somehow encounter James on their mission to rescue Dan and they team up to get into Thousand's lab. They beat the guards one by one and James reads the feet of the defeated guards to figure out Dan's location. They quickly rush inside and Rouge beats up Thousand, who was about to dissect Dan. They take Dan away, but a meteor suddenly hits the city, causing the water to rush in the sewers. They all get swept away by the water, and on the other side, Flora finally wakes up, feeling that Dan is in danger. She runs out to find him and Slash learns that the Earth and Moon are going to collide in 3 days. Meanwhile, the girls find that Dan is no longer breathing and Slash announces to the world that he is holding a League of Legends to find the legend who can save the world. On Earth, Rouge kisses Dan to perform CPR, but Flora arrives at the same time and the scene leaves her shocked. Dan starts breathing again, but Flora gets traumatized after seeing someone take her beloved. According to the legend, the Earth and Moon were created by a ball game between the gods and that the Ultimate Stone was divided between the 2 celestial bodies. It is announced that a number of towns have been fully or almost died with a great loss of life due to the debris from the moon. Ayukawa wonders whether everything is happening because of him and Miyuki assures him that he is not at fault. A Legend League ceremony starts on the moon in which the moon dwellers pay tribute to the lost lives and Slash then gives the speech that the gods' reborn battle is beginning. A lot of refugees gather in the Skybloom town to get access to moon cannon so that they can escape to space, and Germana orders to use military Bigfoots on them if there is a need. He also broadcasts the moon's reporting channel to the Earthlanders, in which they learn that the Legend League match will be played on the moon, and Slash explains to everyone how the energy from the basketball court and the goals will be used to power the veins of the moon. Rouge keeps an eye on Dan, who is still not conscious, while Flora hears some strange voices from the ruins. The 4 participating Legend League teams get announced, which comprise of 3 lunar teams, and at the end the commentator announces a special team from Earth called Toriena Heavens, which consists of Iceman and Falcon only. Haruka arrives to advise Ayukawa that he should put Ultimate on the Bigfoot's feet, but she finds James there and he tells her that he has already tried using Ultimate. The Legend League matches begin, in which 2 matches get played simultaneously and the teams get allowed to play on the surface of the moon as a whole. Haruka and Iceman discuss how they never really understood one another and they hold hands once again. Iceman's team struggles in the Legend League's match as the top lunar team dominates the game and scores points over them. The audience tells his team to go back to the surface and Miyuki gets done with repairs of Dan's Bigfoot. Rouge informs the others that Dan is missing from his room and they all rush outside to see that Dan's Bigfoot is on the move. It turns out that Miyuki is operating the Bigfoot with Dan in her lap because she wants to awaken him, and she tells him about how he used the Bigfoot for the first time. They all hear a strange voice in their mind asking them who they are, and Flora believes that the ruins are talking to all Basquash members, including the Eclipse members. Iceman remembers that he is a Basquasher who can never lose, and he steals the ball from the lunar team to wreak havoc on the moon as well. The king hears the voice of the ruins as well, and suddenly some kind of ruin starts to emerge from the desert. Dan's Bigfoot gets caught up on one of the pillars and it starts to fall down. The voice keeps asking everyone who they are and that their answer will open the doors for them. Dan suddenly wakes up and hits the surface with the basketball in his hand. He declares that he is Dan the Basquasher, and on the moon Iceman announces the same thing. Dan then throws the ball at the ruins and it gets bounced off many times. Iceman does the same thing on the moon and his ball starts tracing a pattern on the moon buildings. He and Falcon also notice that Dan is back on the Earth because they can see the tracing pattern all the way from the moon. Flora keeps hearing some voices and she then faints. Later, she wakes up and tells the group that the ruins are made from the refined form of Ultimate, which is ultimatum, and that they need to make the voice of the ruins reach the moon through singing. The Eclipse group starts singing and soon their van turns into some kind of flying bird which starts to move towards the moon due to the idol's singing powers. Iceman scores the bucket and the most famous lunar team called Toriena Heavens get the win. Falcon asks him if Dan will really come and Iceman tells him that the real Legend League will begin when he arrives. Meanwhile, the flying bird continues to move towards the moon and Violet notices buildings from her hometown in the debris, which makes her wish that her parents are safe. Iceman continues to perform spectacularly on the moon, but it still doesn't activate the Ultimate, and Dan notices that the ship is taking them directly towards Iceman. They arrive at the moon orbit after a while and Slash sets out to greet Dan. Back on Earth, the king reveals that his older brother was the ruler of the moon and he wonders if it's because of their royal blood that they drifted apart from each other. Meanwhile, the group finally lands on the moon and Citron and Violet set out to find their families. The people of the moon chant Dan's name and Slash tells Dan to join the matches as soon as possible because they don't have enough time. Iceman and Falcon continue trying their best to activate the Ultimate because it doesn't work and they both get exhausted. Ayukawa retunes the Bigfoot so they can play on the moon and Slash thanks Ayukawa for his work but calls him so, which shocks Ayukawa. Dan and Iceman eat at a bar like the world is not about to end and they talk about holding a match to decide who is better. On Earth, Germana learns that the people are celebrating and chanting Dan's name because they think that Dan is the true legend. Team Basquash enters the arena and Slash begins having seizures. Back on the Earth, the king sees a picture of Slash and reveals that a secret technique was said to have been passed down through the royal family which allowed them to use the power of Ultimate to become young again. He says that he didn't believe that technique really existed and reveals that Slash is his older brother who was the king of the moon. Slash recalls using the Ultimate's power to become young again and disappearing from the public's eye. Flora also gets vision about it and realizes that Slash is the original ruler of the moon. Down on Earth, Thousand reveals that they were able to learn how to reinforce people because the ruler of the moon shared the secret technique that was passed down the royal family which allowed them to genetically modify people, and she wonders if they were all dancing in the palm of Slash's hands. Flora recalls all the moments she spent with Dan and asks Rouge to play in her place because they cannot win if she plays in the match. Rouge subs in and Dan announces that he came to play a match, not to activate a gauge, so he breaks the Ultimate gauge which tells them how much it has been charged. Back on Earth, Germana orders the legend bullet to be loaded into the moon cannon and the match finally begins on the moon with Dan winning the tip-off against Slash. Slash manages to steal the ball back and scores the first bucket after dribbling past everyone. Dan gets the ball and dribbles past Slash next before passing it to Rouge who dunks it into the bucket. The match continues as Germana prepares to launch the legend bullet and Miyuki notices that Dan's shoes are wearing down. Rouge's condition starts getting and Slash also has a hard time cause it's exactly the time for everyone to get sick. Dan sees Slash's moves and realizes that he is the person who taught them basketball and they go all out against each other. Germana on the other hand starts the countdown for the moon cannon and people start noticing that the Ultimate is slowly activating after each bucket. Rouge also uses the last of her strength to keep up with Dan and Slash, but Germana launches the legend bullet. Moon's self-defense mechanism tries to stop it but it easily pierces through it and Dan manages to pass by Slash thanks to Rouge's help. Flora suddenly hears Slash telling her that he will deal with the legend bullet so she shouldn't worry about it. Slash uses all his strength to chase after Dan but Dan manages to dunk the ball which lights up the runes under the city. Slash blocks the legend bullet and flies away from the moon with it. The runes suddenly die down again and the moon continues to move towards the Earth, but Navi suddenly appears with new shoes for Dan. They all lose hope but hear Iceman still bouncing the ball. Dan wears the new shoes and battles against Iceman while landscape around them crumbles. They give it their all and Nai and Sela start playing against each other too. All the people around the world play their last Basquash and Rouge throws the legend bullet towards Dan and Iceman so that they can play with it. They all dunk at the same time which finally activates the Ultimate and they realize that they were all part of the legend. The moon returns to its orbit and they all return to their normal lives. Coco's legs finally get healed and the world starts recovering from the disaster, but is this really the end or will they face more difficulties to fulfill their passion of Basquash? Comment your thoughts below and make sure to like and subscribe the channel for more sports content.